Hey everyone, how's it going? I come to you for week 3 of Sagalong. So this week we've read another quarter, ostensibly, of Egil's Saga, which I'm continuing to read in this bind-up of the Sagas of the Icelanders. Really, this week's chunk was about a third of the saga. The first 2 weeks of reading that we had was actually together only about a third of the saga, and this week's reading was another third, and this upcoming week's will be the last third. So there's a lot more to talk about in this section, certainly than there was in the last section, in the last quarter. The last quarter, like I said, felt a little bit like the doldrums of the saga, a little bit like setup, a little bit like just sort of a transitional phase, whereas the first quarter of it was actually quite eventful and dramatic. But this section, this third of the saga or so, was quite dramatic and quite thrilling to read, I have to say, actually. I really enjoyed this quarter of the saga. And, you know, if I had to label this part of the saga anything, it would be the amazing adventures of Egil Skallagrimsson. Now, we've touched on how Egil himself is kind of a psychopath, kind of a crazy person, seems very bloodthirsty, does not seem like the kind of person you would ever want to meet, whether in a dark alley or anywhere. But these chapters read to me very much like the adventures of Egil, because we see him travel to many places, we see him raid various places, we see him visit England for a while and help out the King of England, King Athelstan, to fight off an invasion from Scotland, and so on and so forth. So this felt very much like kind of we're looking at the quests of Egil. And I have a lot to say about this chunk. I have a lot of notes out in front of me, and a lot of little bits of the saga that I would like to read, and just comments that I would like to make, because there was a lot here that I found quite fascinating. So I would just get into kind of my notes and what I jotted down as significant. And so I will start with an incident that happens early in this part of the saga. So early in this saga, we see a lot of Egil, along with his brother Thorolf, or as Elizabeth from Bookish North says it, Turolf, going on raids of various places, going Viking, I suppose. And Egil ends up raiding the Courlanders, or Courlanders. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but I'm not sure where that is, but it's not super important. But anyway, he and his band take their longship to Courland and try to raid this area. But then they are caught by the Courlanders and imprisoned. And Egil and his band kind of team up with some other prisoners who are being held and manage to escape in the night. And they escape in the night and then steal all of these goods from the Courlanders, and they're all happy with all their booty. They're going to go and run away and with all their booty and presumably keep it or make some money off of it. But then Egil says something very interesting. When they're fleeing in the night, he stops and says, "This is a poor and cowardly raid. We have stolen all the farmer's wealth without his knowing. Such shame will never befall us. Let's go back to the farm and let people know what has happened." And it was funny, when I first read that, I was like, wow, maybe Egil actually has some morals. Maybe he is not going to just steal all of this stuff. Maybe he's going to go back and, like, give it back to them or something. I was probably very naive in thinking that that's what he meant. But in fact, what he meant was that he was going to go back and kill them all. So he goes back and kills all the Courlanders. And what's interesting, actually, about the scene where he slaughters all these people is that he kills them and then burns their home. And I suppose that was probably not an uncommon thing to do to people you raid, but it is interesting how it's described in a very similar way to how the way that Egil's uncle, Thorolf, also named Thorolf, was killed in the first quarter. So the first quarter of the saga that we read was bookended with Thorolf being killed by King Harald of Norway, whose son Eric now is king of Norway. And he's killed, and then his house is burned. And Egil kills these people and then burns down their house. Now, these people who he kills do not play any further significant role in the saga, at least thus far. And so it's hard to read too much into it, but I did note that his killing of them was rather similar to the way that Thorolf was killed. So that invites, to my mind, a kind of comparison, actually, between Egil and King Harold, which I wasn't expecting. But, I think you can kind of get the sense that if Egil had been given the same kind of power that Harold had been given, he might be kind of similar to Harold. He might also be a tyrant. He might be a bit more strong-minded, strong-willed than Harold was, because remember, Harold was very easily influenced by his people around him. But Egil, I think, would also be kind of a tyrant if he were given the same power as Harold. So I noted that similarity, and that actually speaks to something else that I will come back to later that I noticed in this chunk of the saga, which is that there are a couple of echoes back to things that happened in the earlier part of the saga. So we see that there was some foreshadowing in that first part of the saga, and that events in this part are reflecting those events. And this is one of the first of those. I'm going to note another one later. But anyway, moving on to a more humorous incident. So not long after Egil and his band escape from the Kurlanders, Egil and Thorolf stay with a guy who is the Earl of Halland. I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly, but it's not important sort of who he is, because he doesn't really end up playing much of a role in the saga beyond this one scene. But Egil and Thorolf stay with this guy called the Earl of Halland, and they're going to have dinner with this Earl and his court, and Egil takes the seat of this young woman, a daughter of the Earl. And Egil and this young woman have this exchange, and she comes up to him and speaks to him in verse, as one does, and she says, "What do you want my seat for? You have not often fed wolves with warm flesh. I'd rather stroke my own fire. This autumn you did not see ravens screeching over chopped bodies. You were not there when razor-sharp blades clashed." So that's her opening salvo. And Egil responds like this. He says, "I have wielded a blood-stained sword and howling spear. The bird of carrion followed me when the Vikings pressed forth. In fury we fought battles. Fire swept through men's homes. We made bloody bodies slump dead by city gates." And then the narrator says after that, "They drank together that night and got on well together." So I guess that's their, Romeo and Juliet sonnet, right? Romeo and Juliet speak a sonnet to each other when they first meet. I guess that's their version of it. And then they got on well together. I don't know whether that's a euphemism, but that young woman never heard from again, never plays any further role in the saga as far as we know so far. And I don't know what get on well together means in Old Icelandic, but we will leave it up to everyone's imagination. So that was a funnier incident. There are all these little incidents that don't have a big impact on the wider saga story that are interesting in their own way, right? Like that first incident with the Kurlanders, this incident, that are just kind of neat in their own way. Okay, but now to move on to aspects of the story that are more immediately relevant to the kind of overall arc of the saga. And that is something that comes out in this part of the saga is Gunhild, who is the wife of Eric, who is now king of Norway. And she becomes this very vengeful influence on King Eric. She is bloodthirsty. She does not want him to forgive the heirs of Skalagrim for what his family did to the family of King Eric. And she wants blood. She basically, when she thinks Eric is being too forgiving to Egil and Thorolf, she enlists her own brothers to kill one or both Egil and Thorolf, and or any men under them. And, this seems like a classic case of, behind every powerful man, there's an even more powerful woman, right? What I actually sort of appreciate about the portrayal of Gunhild is that she seems to be just as vengeful and violent as the men in the story are. And I actually kind of appreciate that there's a female character who's just as unlikable and violent, or at least she doesn't exactly commit violence herself, right? But she wants violence to be committed, and I actually appreciate it when there are female characters who are portrayed in that way. This, because the idea that women are these sort of gentle, warm people who are always peaceful is, I think, a kind of a stereotype. So I actually appreciate that there's a female character who's just as, insane as all the male characters are. But she comes out as kind of a villain. Actually, I think she's more, to a degree, in control than Eric is. And it's interesting because Eric's father, Harold, also was easily controlled by people around him. Not by in Harold's case, it wasn't his wife, it was his bureaucrats, sort of. But so Eric kind of seems to be continuing sort of the family tradition of being easily influenced by people around you. All right, now moving on to a part of the saga that I thought was really cool. Part of this saga takes place in England. Actually, a lot of this saga takes place in England, which I was not expecting. I did not know that a lot of this saga takes place in England. And so I was just thrilled when we get mention of Alfred the Great, right? The king of Wessex, I believe, who united all of England and drove out, I believe it was Norwegians or Vikings who were invading England in the early centuries before 1000 AD. I don't know the specific dates, but it's somewhere in that period after the fall of the Roman Empire, before 1000 AD. And we get mention of King Alfred. He does not appear. Actually, his, I believe, grandson, King Athelstan of England, is sort of the major English king who we hear from. He's not a super striking character. He doesn't have a lot of dialogue. He doesn't do a lot. He's actually described in kind of lesser terms than his father and grandfather, even though he actually seems to be doing quite well. But basically what happens is that Egil and Thorolf flee Norway because Eric still doesn't like them very much, and so they flee from Norway with their band of men, and they arrive in England and decide to find work there, and they end up fighting for King Athelstan. And what's going on in England is that Scotland, which is ruled by King Olaf, is invading England, as Scotland did a few times. And so they help King Athelstan to fight King Olaf off. And there's this really cool scene where the English army knows that they're very outnumbered by the Scottish army, but they kind of pretend that they trick the Scottish army into thinking that there's more of them than there really are by encamping on the top of a mountain and setting up a bunch of tents on the very top of the mountain, so that not a mountain, probably a hill, but they set up a lot of tents on the very top of the hill to give the illusion that there's a ton of tents going back behind the hill. And so that kind of intimidates the Scottish army. And then they also keep kind of delaying the battle with the Scottish army by telling them, oh, let us send some messengers to King Athelstan to ask him about this possible deal we might make. Wait, we have a counteroffer. Let us send another messenger to King Athelstan to see if this other deal will work out. And so they keep kind of buying time. And more English soldiers arrive until kind of the English force is more evenly matched with the Scottish army. And that's kind of a wonderful scene as well. And then, of course, battle eventually breaks out, and the English army is victorious in large part due to the help of Thorolf and Egil. However, Thorolf is actually killed in battle. So Egil gets honored with wealth and favor from King Athelstan, but his brother has died. And what I thought was notable about when Thorolf is killed is that even though earlier in the saga we had been told that there was a lot of tension between Egil and his brother, Egil still clearly is quite devastated by Thorolf's death, or at least he's, melancholic after Thorolf's death. It emphasizes his melancholy after Thorolf's death, and he composes actually quite a touching verse about Thorolf's death. and I'll go ahead and read it to you because it's quite short. A lot of the verses in this saga are quite short, but this is it. The slayer of the Earl, unfearing, ventured bravely forth in the thunder god's din. Bold-hearted Thorolf fell. The ground will grow over my great brother near when, deep as my sorrow is, I must keep it to myself. And those last verses are kind of interesting because not too long after, Egil is described as having this kind of long-term melancholy after Thorolf's death. He's described as sitting with his head down very frequently and described as being very generally melancholic. And Bjorn, a friend of his, a very interesting character who I haven't talked about very much, and I don't think I will get to talking about very much, but he's quite a fascinating character. But Bjorn basically comes to him and says, even though you have suffered a great loss with your brother's death, the manly thing to do is bear it well. And so we have this kind of what I see as a very sort of toxically masculine idea of, oh, you're supposed to be strong outside, right? Like you can feel sad inside, but you don't show it, right? That's a very sort of traditional masculine idea, which I see as very toxic, and here it is expressed in this saga. Now, whether the saga itself supports this idea or not, I don't know. I don't know that Bjorn's statement is portrayed in a positive light or not. The thing is that the narrator of the saga doesn't tend to comment very much on what happens. It just kind of reports what happens in a very matter-of-fact way. And I do like that the narrator isn't sort of holding your hand through the whole thing, telling you what to think. But anyway, so we have this introduction, at least in this one scene, of this toxically masculine idea. And obviously there's a lot of sort of machismo stuff going on throughout this saga, but that really leapt out. And what we also find out in that scene is that Egil is not only sad over the death of his brother, but he's also love-stricken. He happens to be in love with his now dead brother's widow, Asgerd. And he composes my favorite poem so far that's in the saga, and I'll read that one to you too. He composes this love poem, and this is it. The goddess of the arm where hawks perch, woman, must suffer my rudeness. When young, I would easily dare to lift the sheer cliffs of my brow. Now I must conceal in my cloak the outcrop between my brows when she enters the poet's mind, headdress of the rock giant's earth. So I thought that was a lovely poem, but Egil and Asgerd end up getting married, and it's actually rather unclear what Asgerd thinks of the match. We're not given much look into her mind or into what she thinks of this marriage. We don't hear from her very much. So it's hard to know how much she actually liked the idea of marrying her dead husband's brother. But they get married, and they don't seem to have that much strife. But anyway, another thing that I wanted to mention, I meant to touch on it earlier when I talked about Egil and Thorolf being in England, is that when Egil and Thorolf are in England, they adopt Christianity, actually. One of the conditions of King Athelstan taking them into his army is for them to convert to Christianity. And that's leapt out at me because, it becomes very clear late as the saga continues that they're not very good Christians. They continue to make reference to the gods, to the pagan gods, to Odin, and Egil does this very pagan ritual at one point later in the saga, which I will talk about in a minute. And so clearly they aren't particularly good Christians. They seem to have adopted Christianity mostly out of convenience, right? Just so that they could get into King Athelstan's service. And so they basically just went through the motions and then went back to being pagans, right? And so that kind of places this story in, this period in European history, and I imagine there are parallels in other areas of the world, but this fascinating process of gradual Christianization. You have these periods in history where people have sort of, again, gone through the motions, ostensibly converted, but really aren't what you would call Christians, right? They still practice the old ways. They do old rituals. They may go through the motions of Christianity, but they don't really believe, and they still adhere to the old ways. And so that reminded me of a couple of films that I've seen, actually. I haven't read so many books from that period, but a couple of films that deal with this period, and they're films that I adore. One of them is The Virgin Spring, directed by Ingmar Bergman. The other one is a Czechoslovak film from 1967, which is rather obscure, called Markéta Lazarova. And Markéta Lazarova, actually, I think would be a really interesting sort of thematic companion piece to Egil's saga, because like Egil's saga, it's full of vengeful, violent, horrific people, but it takes place in this period where a lot of these people ostensibly are Christian, but aren't being particularly good Christians, and so anyway, it's cool that this saga takes place inside of that really interesting period of history, and I would like to learn more about that period. So that's on me. I need to do more reading on that. But anyway, so I wanted to touch on that. And then we move into one of the major pieces of drama in this part of the saga is another dispute over inheritance. Disputes over inheritance seem to be a really big recurring theme in the sagas, clearly. Clearly, it was very important in Icelandic society. And there are a couple of ironic aspects to the inheritance dispute. So what happens is that Asgerd, who is now Egil's wife, Asgerd's father dies. And her father has her as a daughter and has one other daughter and no sons. And so, according to Icelandic law, his estate should be divided between Asgerd and her sister. But Asgerd's sister's husband does not regard Asgerd as legitimate, because she was the daughter of, as he says, a concubine. And again, you can see kind of the ambiguous nature of marriage at the time, which I wasn't expecting to learn about. But it's fascinating to look at older societies and realize that this idea of being married versus not being married is actually a lot more blurry than we might regard it today, especially since a lot of societies, I think, didn't have formal marriage ceremonies. When you got married, you just kind of started living together and having kids, and that was that. And so marriage, whether or not two people were married, was a bit more of a blurry issue in some societies and in certain points in history. But anyway, so Asgerd's basically brother-in-law, her sister's husband, doesn't regard her as legitimate because she was the daughter of a woman that he did not regard as their father's wife. And Egil, of course, gets in a rage about this, and there's a whole trial, and there are witnesses, and Egil challenges Berg Onund, that's the name of the husband of the sister. He challenges Berg Onund to battle, to a duel, and I don't believe the duel happens, but what I think is ironic about this particular inheritance dispute is that in that first quarter of the saga, Thorolf, Uncle Thorolf, so Skallagrim's brother Thorolf, not Egil's brother Thorolf Senior, let's say, had denied two brothers an inheritance because he did not regard them as legitimate sons of someone, and that was kind of one of the inciting events, I should say, of the events of that first quarter of the saga, because those two brothers are kind of the two bureaucrats who turned King Harold against Uncle Thorolf. And so that inheritance dispute in the first quarter is an inciting incident for basically the whole saga. And here we see Egil having a similar accusation leveled against Asgerd having a similar accusation leveled against her, and she is married to Thorolf's nephew, who had leveled a similar accusation. So it's just ironic that accusation is being leveled against the family of Thorolf Sr., And so again, we just see these echoes, right, between the story, these echoes, this foreshadowing and such. And I feel like that also gives the saga this cyclical feel, like things just keep happening in the same way, right? That, like, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Which kind of just works back into the general, like, pessimistic tone of a lot of sagas, right? This, this idea that people are violent, people go through these cycles of revenge and dispute and violence, and it never ends, and so on and so forth. And I think that that's one of the most powerful aspects of the sagas, one of the most powerful and important aspects thematically of the saga. Now, my next bit that I want to talk about is one of my favorite bits in this part of the saga. And this happens late in our chunk for this week. But at one point, Egil decides that he is going to curse King Eric and Queen Gunhild. And the way that he does it is with what I guess is called a knithing pole or a knitting pole. I looked this up, I didn't know it previously. But a knitting pole or knitting pole, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it's, I'll type it on the screen for you if you want to see how it's spelled. And basically what it is he takes the head of a horse and pierces it onto the end of a spear, sticks the spear in the ground, and points the head directly at the kingdom of Eric and Gunhild. And by that point in the saga, I should tell you, but you probably presumably read, but by that point in the saga, Eric and Gunhild are ruling over Northumbria in England. Because what happened a little bit earlier in the saga is that they were actually driven out of Norway by King Eric's brother. His brother, who incidentally is named Harold, who's now ruling as King of Norway himself. So Eric and Gunhild fled Norway after being driven out by Eric's brother Harold, and fled to England, where King Athelstan allowed them to take over rulership of Northumbria to defend it against Scottish raids. So that's quite a dynamic there, because again, Athelstan had been allied with Egil and Thorolf, right, and so on and so forth. But anyway, don't need to get into that. But at one point, Egil decides he's going to curse Gunhild and Eric, and I will just read you the passage because I think it's kind of cool. So this is the passage where Egil curses them. He took a hazel pole in his hand and went to the edge of a rock facing inland. Then he took a horse's head and put it on the end of the pole. Afterwards he made an invocation, saying, "Here I set up this scorn pole, and turn its scorn upon King Eric and Queen Gunhild." Then turned the horse's head to face land. "And I turn its scorn upon the nature spirits that inhabit this land, sending them all astray so that none of them will find its resting place by chance or design, until they have driven King Eric and Gunhild from this land." Then he thrust the pole into a cleft in the rock and left it to stand there. He turned the head towards the land and carved the whole invocation in runes on the pole. So that is pretty hardcore by my mind. And I actually got a lot of like Lord of the Flies vibes from that. I'd be curious to know whether maybe the author of Lord of the Flies is escaping me now, but it would be I would be Arthur Golding. No, not Arthur Golding. Anyway, the author of I can't remember the name of the author of Lord of the Flies. I would be curious to know whether he got the idea for the pig's head on the stick from like the knithing pole idea. I'd be curious to know, but I just thought that was a really striking passage. And it's kind of like this point of no return, right? It's like, don't burn any bridges, man, and he seems to be burning bridges. But then the bridge is somehow mended, because not too long afterward, Egil ends up visiting King Eric and Gunhild in Northumbria, and at first he very much fears for his life, being in Northumbria where they rule. He did not mean to arrive in Northumbria, he arrived there by accident, but what happens when he gets there is that his friend Bjorn, who again is quite a fascinating character who I haven't touched on very much, I apologize for that, but I think Tilly and Roz talk about him a little bit. But Bjorn basically goes out on a limb and really puts his neck on the line for Egil to try to help him mend his relationship with Eric. And Bjorn implores King Eric to don't kill him, forgive him, he'll do something to make it up for you. And Eric seems very hesitant. Of course, Gunhild doesn't want any part of this. She wants Egil dead. But Bjorn has an idea and pitches it to Egil. And what he tells Egil to do is to write a long poem in praise of King Eric and perform it for him. And that should please him and get him to forgive you. And this is the first of a couple of lengthier verses that we will get in the saga. And it's quite a fascinating piece because it, on a very superficial level, does seem to be praising King Eric, but then when you look at the imagery and dissect some of the verses, you realize that there are these ironic undertones, and at one point there's even, I think, a full-on joke in the last stanza about King Eric. Not like a laugh-out-loud joke, but something that I think is meant to be a joke. And I don't want to read the whole poem out because it's rather long, but it was the first of these lengthy poems that we will get, and I found it quite interesting. I'm more excited for the subsequent poems, because sort of ironic, jokey poems are not my cup of tea, really. But this one I did find quite interesting, and Eric sort of takes it at face value. He doesn't notice the sort of irony and jokes in it, and so he takes it at face value, and doesn't really forgive Egil, but he at least lets him go free. He at least lets him leave Northumbria alive. And he does. So those are all the specific notes I have. This is going to be probably my longest Sagalong video ever. I'm really starting to love this saga. I might actually love it more than Njál's saga. Egil himself, obviously he's the most complex character who we get to explore. And when we first met him, he just seemed like, a mini psychopath, basically. And he still commits all of these violent acts, right? Like, I started out with that story about him slaughtering a bunch of people. He kills a 10-year-old boy in this part of the saga as well. So he's not violent anymore. But he does seem to at least be, reining himself in just a little bit. And I think there are some possible signs of growth. Growth, quote-unquote growth, as in that he's less psychopathic, perhaps, than he was before. But he's quite interesting. And I feel like, we are kind of invited to sympathize with him a bit, right? Like the passage after Thorolf dies, right? When we see him melancholic about that, but also pining after Asgerd and such. And so he's coming out as this kind of anti-hero kind of guy, right? Like, I feel like when I think of him, I actually think of someone like Tony Soprano from the eponymous show, who also is just a vile human being, right? Like, Tony Soprano, he's horrible. He's a horrible man. And yet we do, sympathize with him, sort of, a little bit. and so it's interesting how popular the anti-hero has become in television. And here is, a prime example of an anti-hero in, a saga written in 13th century Iceland, right? So, anyway, I'm loving the saga. I would love to hear any of your thoughts on anything that I have said in this video. I know it's been a very long video, as I noted, but please give me your thoughts on the saga, because I am loving it and would love to discuss it further with people who are reading it or have read it. So anyway, let me know what you think, and I will leave it at that. Talk to you all later.